Hello all, and welcome to my introduction to Jean Baudrillard's, to his magnum opus, or at least certainly the most acclaimed text in a mainstream capacity. A lot of people, however, would say that some of these concepts are demonstrated perhaps better in other texts or opinions that Baudrillard may have that have changed over the course of his 40 or so books could be demonstrated perhaps in different texts in better ways. Nonetheless, this is a standalone for Simulacra and Simulation, which was released in 1981. And so, if we were going to really contrast how Baudrillard would talk of signs and signification, and he has that reputation, if you will, for being the philosopher for the opening and possibilities of signs and how they exchange, then you get a much different Baudrillard, or at least an outlook here. And I think there's something to that with kind of this postmodern consensus, or at least theory, if you will, or a sort of metaphysical principle even, at least in the history of their ideas, with regards to wherever liberation could be found, you also have repression, or something similar could be said to how Deleuze and Guattari perhaps would see something like, let's say, the state apparatuses and these sort of interrelated relationships, and how they formulate into a sort of ratio, I would say. In some regards, there's certainly that reading that you're trying to find this sort of quilting of smooth and striated spaces. But nonetheless, before going along in a bunch of different directions here, I wanted to start with, of course, famously or infamously, depending on how you look at it, there's the Ecclesiastes quote, which has been proven or debunked to be fake. And in a weird way, even though Baudrillard likely believed that this was a real quote, I think that kind of plays into some of the concepts, or at least the processes that Baudrillard talks about, where simulation, in that sense, what is actually real, or the hyper-real, as compared to states of affairs, if you'd like. And in that kind of capacity, we could perhaps say that fake quotes are also real quotes, or at least there's no real omega point, if you will, to discern between the two. Now, of course, this is said with a bit of reverence towards trying to document states of affairs, as compared to the sort of cinematic way, as we'll get into later, and Baudrillard does in this text, of even something like documenting, or the autobiography perhaps, as compared to this sort of neutral way perhaps of trying to think about these sorts of things. And so, essentially, to start with the text, he's really pointing out that there's different degrees really of simulation, or at least the order of it. And so trying to bind simulation into a sort of theory bro concept, if you will, is actually in and of itself reductionary, because of course there is a historical embeddedness involved here with simulation, and how the codes of order, or our repression, our cultural norms, those aggregates, and how they relate to each other, if you will, is really what he means with simulation. And so trying to describe simulation, of course you could do that perhaps in the context of your own being, if you'd like, to maybe put in Heidegger here. But this isn't still the overarching, idea of simulation and how it would perhaps be different, or its ordering would be different in different epochs and different epistemes, or at least how they would be spoken about in a language capacity. So essentially, Baudrillard has, of course, this reputation of, being one of technics, one of the digital sphere, but this diminishes perhaps what he really means when he's talking about things like simulation or the simulacra, and what its capacity and value could actually be, as opposed to just this sort of 21st century way of describing it. And I think that's a subtle misconception, or at least a sort of reduction in our reading of him, that I think is worth mentioning again here. But if we were going to look perhaps at what, and address the elephant in the room, of course, is the Matrix films and their influence, and how, just like perhaps with the Ecclesiastes quote, which wasn't a real quote, we could say the same perhaps of how Baudrillard is perceived by mass media, or the greater outward culture, if you will, compared to what he really had to say. And there is a sort of reverence I have here for Baudrillard as an intellectual, where he could have just been a sort of pop culture brief icon, if you will, and probably cashed out and gained some notoriety with the status if he would have just played along with the Matrix. But of course, this was a bastardization of his philosophy. And so if we were going to get into that now, when he talks about this in The Conspiracy of Art, which I think is an interview, or maybe it was a writing, there's so much Baudrillard content, right? And so, the value of simulation, or reality, if you'd like, as demonstrated with the Matrix films, it's a crude and even platonic, a simplistic, divided line, really, where the characters are either inside this hyperreal, or they are outside of it, in Zion, and in the real structure, if you will. But Baudrillard asks, what would be the entry point where both of those worlds met at the same time? And this real and simulation dichotomy that's produced really within the film, and you could argue, of course, that this is simply out of accessibility for these images, which of course in a way conforms it to a sort of simulation. This ultimately misses the point, though, of really the blurring of those two forms that Baudrillard finds ourselves in, where you can't necessarily point to just simply this is the real and this is the hyper-real. For Baudrillard, that misses the point of what's really happening here, where those platonic forms, those degrees of reality, are diluting or have dissolved. They have no reference really anymore behind the significance or the sign regimes as they interact with each other. But to perhaps bring Plato in to understand better here, of course, with the Plato in the Republic, there's differences in reality. There's a sort of order from the divine, where the divine is the greatest instantiation of reality, and then there's the degrees outside of it. Perhaps the craftsman and the creation of objects, or the use of it in a technical standpoint, is a degree removed from the real. And so this really perhaps could help with understanding what Baudrillard is going to say with the ordering of these simulacra. And so the second order, to get into it, really corresponded to the real. When we think of the history of ideas here, of course, he constantly references the likes of Freud and Marx, or the libido sort of abstract understanding and the political economy, sort of, the mapping, if you will. And so this was a sort of doubling. You're taking the theories of that epoch, if you will, such as the self-conscious or material dialectics, if you'd like. This, of course, was done with the spirit or the telos, of course, of tracing of a map of simulation, where there isn't really a substance or being. There's no reference to the real as it transforms and goes forward into what he would call the hyperreal. And so simulation in and of itself, and this is important, I think, to point out, that of course, since I demonstrated with how that concept really, in a lot of ways, can't just be articulated, but or at least in its full truthfulness, if you'd like, it's bounded historically, it's imbued, if you will. And so simulation then shouldn't really have these sort of value judgments of simulation in itself being oppressive. And this is why, of course, with any astute philosopher, you have these new terms or at least differentiations between these concepts. And so again, the simulation in and of itself for Baudrillard, he sees it as a sort of neutral because it's an opening and a closing in that sort of way at the same time. And so, the historical quality of it across cultures and epochs gives ultimately its relationship to the world. And so in and of itself, simulation for Baudrillard starts with our use of language and the mode of references across, and how we communicate to each other, which in order to do that is collectively agreed upon. So you see with language here, you have a sort of simulation that's agreed upon to be used collectively. So simulation isn't innately really oppression or really anything, I would say, for that matter. But in the case of what we'll get into with hyperreality really for Baudrillard is that sort of code of oppression, of the repressive aspects, or at least the analysis really that's much more reserved than the opening of signs that we saw with seduction as a concept in past videos here. Essentially, we're leaving the realm of the real to the truth, and we're liquidating all the references, and as such, a material world is far more malleable than the actual meaning of that material world, if you'd like. In some ways, we could perhaps interject how Nietzsche comes in at the start of the century to really reiterate that, of course, the only real truth is the will to power. And so I think that in some context here could be meaningful to see how Baudrillard sees the way the ordering of the simulation and patching that in with something like the will to power. Baudrillard is saying of the hyperreal that there's a sort of danger outside of seduction, and of course seduction in of itself has is embedded in mystery and chaos, but here hyperreality is much more in opposition really to significance that we saw demonstrated earlier. And so really our freedoms and even the restrictive or repressive hypothesis as well reigns true here again for Baudrillard as really common with how, take the milieus if you'd like, the territories conform to the mapping or our phenomenological way we are perhaps looking at phenomenon. And so ultimately they're kind of synthesizing and becoming each other. We're conforming nature into this, and nature kind of is willing to be zoned and used as such in a very unnatural way. I think Baudrillard is pointing at us in a sort of paradox here. And so Baudrillard actually on the divine, he really asks, what is the divine, or God, if you'd like, other than a sort of simulacra, where all that really remains is the incarnation of images, and the simulacra, or at least the fascination, the fixation of it. Bode's true even going as far back to what he says of Plato here, where only that simulacrum actually existed. God is of itself has always been put into that degree of the simulacrum, which is the first form of the degree of reality. But this is still ultimately only a simulation and one of fascination. God essentially has only made himself or themselves in the form of signs and significance. And I think that's a really interesting way to see how Baudrillard here sees of the divine, and really how seduction and mystery, what has not yet been accounted for, if you'd like, what rattles and shakes the statistical aggregates and averages that we produce or zone into the world, the way it presents itself, you have to beg the question that even the prior instantiation of these formalized rules, how did that come to be unless there was a sort of a mystery, or even a degree away from the given simulation, perhaps, or the simulacra, and how ultimately that can transform. And I think that's really interesting, and you could spend all day thinking about something like that. Baudrillard is really fascinating, and it's kind of funny to see how I've already made 7 or 8 videos before I even introduced, or I think it was more like 4 or 5, before I even introduced this text here, because Baudrillard, he actually has this sort of seduction within his writings where you can't really get away from him sometimes. I kind of enjoy that about him. But I digress here, and now I want to reiterate and point out the real 4 phases of the simulacra, which starts really with a reflection of a reality. And so we could think perhaps of the artist, or the landscape Renaissance painting, if you'd like, which capitulated, or had that sort of scholastic in the history of ideas of reiterating the divine, or reiterating a sort of natural order, and reifying it in different forms of media or art form. But in the second phase, you're talking of the demasking or the denaturing of a profound reality. And so this is when you start to see really the mapping that comes towards a territory or a phenomenon. And then this leads way to that third, through that doubling, which actually masks the profound reality. So now we're actually forgetting the milieu, if you'd like, the transformation of that territory that was actually underneath, or at least in its own processes, to now conform to our processes that we don't necessarily have any sort of reference or really a way of communicating in a formalized way that same profound reality that used to be sufficient enough to reference it, but has now been unmoored, if you'd like. And then when you get to the fourth one, this is when you get into that pure simulacrum, which is a building of that third stage of the exchange of signs that don't necessarily have any sort of milieu reference or any sort of realness, if you'd like, or the doubling, or at least the understanding of what put into that doubling to begin with, before it was just an abstract concept and relating to other abstract concepts. And so, again, you're seeing the forgetting of the territory, which belongs really to that fourth stage in that process. But what is really the hyperreal? What is the purpose of it? We've been talking about it for a while now, but it is really essentially a strategy or even a coping mechanism in some capacity. Simulation gives us a sort of a realness. It's the things it represents hasn't actually gone away or didn't disappear, or if you'd like, with Heidegger, that sort of truth that came with something prior in the sort of Dasein. It now actually has no real reference or energy to that prior instantiation. And so the disappearance of it is something that we're always sort of being repressive, really, in some capacity. And this really creates a sort of linear culture that has collapsed away, where you just have these stockpiling of images and past theories that are just simply presented in this sort of hypermarket, if you'd like, as these different really theories of the world, but none of them actually demonstrate into a reference or a doubling of that world. It is simply the references between each other that I think is really an ailment of our time, or at least aids us with our praxis of how we really think about this kind of stuff. Put more meat on the bones here, as he does. He's gonna really demonstrate in several cases here of a sort of example, really, with sexuality, which we convince ourselves hasn't been done away with or has transformed into something that we no longer map onto the territory of what sexuality was or used to be, and we replace it with the pornographic image. And such is the case as well with money. We convince ourselves that there's plenty of money to go around and it hasn't disappeared, where, of course, if you talk to someone like a Ron Paul supporter, if you'd like, the movement away from the gold standard, that was the real money, that was what was actually real. And now you have credit scores, you have the credit card and interest system, where there's actually no money here to be had, but we delude ourselves into thinking that there's such an abundance of it that we can just issue in money almost without limitations. But you may be saying perhaps that, oh, this means that we must free ourselves from such a delusion if sexuality, if the sort of finance that we see demonstrated with industrial capitalism, if you'd like, or exploitation and power dynamics, perhaps, if these have all disappeared, then we must liberate ourselves, of course, and do away with thinking about the strategies that really is the hyperreal. But to counter that, and Baudrillard does this too, what would that world actually look like? And it might not be a world that you might want to live in, actually, simply because if we don't believe in any of this, then perhaps we don't really know what would really happen, if you'd like, or at least how it would be taken. To really think about it, what if nature never was, to go, to the umpteenth power here and really push this idea to its very edge. What if there never was nature? What if there was never any sort of concept of a real sexuality? These are questions that Baudrillard really posits for us, and I think it's very interesting to look at. Only when we actually gave it its telos and zoned it, which of course is, again, something rather unnatural to do, or at least that's how Baudrillard would see it. To give these properties a sort of phenomenological basis that we exhibit onto it. Is that nature, or are we conforming nature? That's, again, the one of the interesting questions that you perhaps want to ask. And now we reach to his conversation, if you'd like, on Disneyland, which of course is a rather famous reference in this book. Baudrillard essentially is asking, what is Disneyland? Like, what's Disneyland really about? And, it's a fantastical, mythical, unreal world that we enter into. But, this convinces us that outside of Disneyland, America, as he would, usually reference rather frequently and wrote about, America itself is actually a sort of Disneyland. It's a sort of clown world, if you want to use contemporary memes. And in it of itself, it really designates where the cartoon and the fake is. But of course, America is playing a character itself as a sort of global hegemonic power. It's not... you could perhaps say, of course, that, there's degrees of how real that would be compared to Disneyland, but is America ultimately still not standing into that role that it produced for itself? And we'll get into that later with how he sees really the tyranny of the global. But, no matter what, whether we became a despotic third world country overnight, there's still a sort of character that, a nation really puts itself in that I at least associate here with Baudrillard. And people could perhaps, have contention with that. But, in addition to just saying, America is the great superpower and, that, vacuous sort of instrumentalization, if you'd like, which, of course, I... am not a fan of myself. That perhaps is the character that you would think of, and Baudrillard is kind of angling at here. But, I think you should expand that even further and say, even if America, lost its sort of global power, or at least domination, if you'd like, it would still, have characters to it that, still exhibit what he really means with, being outside of Disneyland as, this is now where the adults are. This is where the real is. And of course, Baudrillard is very suspicious of such things. But this is really to say, though, that simulation is not in opposition of the real. Again, this is another dichotomy that people who are, projecting onto Baudrillard here. And he understands, to some degree that, these sorts of philosophical concepts and themes sort of get centralized and broken down so that way they can be consumed in a sort of decentralized mass consumer way. And so you kind of lose some of, what the thinker is really trying to reiterate, I think, because you're conforming it to, the mass consumption of it. And so this is to say then that, simulation isn't just in this binary against the real. It's much more dynamic and interwoven, actually, which in a way makes it troublesome and, makes hyperreal the way Baudrillard sees it. But if we were to have, an opposition really to the real, it would be of illusion that Baudrillard references. which is really the possible of discovering the sort of absolute real, if you like. And, as such, this makes illusion not any more possible because the real isn't possible. And so you have that sort of postmodern mentality here where, a sort of illusion, if you like, actually becomes the opposition of the real because, you're trying to totalize something that can't actually be totalized. And so it's a sort of illusion. And so if we're going to take this over to power then, power thrives in the loss of the distinction, in its strategy of the loss of the real. And so you see the injecting of the reference to the real with mass media or simulation strategies where you're bombarded with images in this mass consumptive society. And, as such, everything that kind of is intelligible, if you like, or plays into our contemporary lives has to go through the simulation in some form by its enforcement of meaning into the world. And so essentially the strategy is how we're injecting meaning into the system to give its meaning, to make Marxism real in that sort of way, or whatever formalized structure you would like. We actually inject that into the territory. And so given its meaning, nothing is detrimental to that system then, as is the case with, you see every real president now. When is the last time there hasn't been one that hasn't been attempted to be impeached or removed in some capacity, even in times and eras of American history, if you'd like, where, we're told that things were peace-loving and, there's a sort of togetherness, if you'd like, with the American culture. You still had, at least in the political landscape, the semblance of the political, of exerting away potential threats to it. And for Baudrillard, this is not revolutionary at all. This is simply reimbursing the system and saying, okay, now we've cleansed our palate of Nixon, as those references here. But of course, you could think of the 45th president of the United States, where, even if you don't like him, the narrative ultimately was, once we get this guy out of office, the adults will be in charge again. And I think that rings true with what Baudrillard is saying here in his real suspicion of, trying to just cut the serpent's head off of a power structure could actually play into that own power structure and how it will resuscitate itself again. Nixon, in that sense, really arrives to be enough danger to the group that he has to be liquidated back into the system. And so that's how you make the system real again, by removing Nixon, by removing Trump, if you'd like, or whatever the troublesome individual can be. And so this is really playing into that sort of repression of the formulation of a sort of locus of power that we can all shed and regain a system that's, for the people, if you'd like, or it gives back its credits. We're going back to our founding father principles, if you'd like. But this is ultimately just the maintenance of that very system. Now, if we were going to be revolutionary to Baudrillard, we would actually reject that we're, returning to some real system by simply removing a form of power, if you'd like, or a face of power, and cutting the serpent's head off. Now our problems are solved. But in the end, we're actually just reinstantiating that very system that created that individual that, went mad, if you'd like. And so that's what Baudrillard, I think, is really trying to get at here. And so we are predicated on the maintenance of the hyperreal formula by developing those very changes. but there's no single point that makes the eye of the TV and how he looks at the panopticon, where there's the sort of gaze of the authoritarian figure towards us, but we are also gazing back at it. And so we presuppose the despotic gaze in the system of mapping, of being seen or being seen. Even if the panoptic point is in and of itself blind, we actually play into that very system of the panopticon by the way we think about this and its despotic gaze. We send our gaze back to the TV, to the objects, to the subjects, and as such, you could perhaps think of the becoming wasp and orchid plateau and 1,000 plateaus here, where there's no fixed Hegelian dialectic of, okay, here is you now, and here is the subject or the other, if you'd like, and in your interrelations, you still contribute such and such, and then they contribute such and such. Whereas, of course, with the wasp and the orchid, they're both simultaneously one and not in that sort of paradoxical way. And so I think Baudrillard, he's really reiterating that here with how, we become despotic, not just in how the despotic gaze is placed upon us, like this webcam, looking at me right now, or how you guys are looking at me right now, but ultimately I am also looking back into the camera, and I am playing into that very formula. But then he turns really to Marshall McLuhan, and of course his thesis of the medium and the message, which Baudrillard, throws away really by stating that if mediums are everywhere, or supports the moving of these images, then it can't be reductionary to just simply the TV or the internet or the webcam, but the formula actually disappears because all of these medium forms are involved, and so everything is actually diluted down to those mediums, and so the formula really loses its capacity then, because in its disappearance, everything is the medium as it dilutes itself. And so there's no longer a medium that diffracts into the real. No one can even say that the medium actually is altered by it, because of course it's everywhere. And so just like he does with Marshall here, he really applies that to a lot of the thinkers at the time, especially with the likes of Foucault and his power analysis, or the capillary powers, if you'd like, where you have a sort of overarching formula, if you like, that can really apply to everywhere. It's just like with the case with Marx and the proletarian, the exploitation of the factory worker. Well, its end actually would be that the factory actually becomes the outside as well, and you are no longer inside the factory because the factory is now outside of it. I know that's a kind of a sort of hazy statement to make, but I think if you pick at it for a few minutes, you could see what he really means when he's going at these overarching sort of thesis, if you like, almost a sort of theological praxis, or at least demonstration, where the divine in that sort of sense is everywhere and nowhere. And a lot of these secular writers here apply this same sort of rubric of the divine through the notions of these processes, such as the libido, if you like, or the political economy, or desire. But if we were going to turn to what is the inflection point, if you like, for hyperreality, what is its telos? What does it really want? And for Baudrillard, he suggests that this is the law of equivalence, really, or at least the eradication in a formalized sense of really negativity or contradiction, and as such moves us towards total operativity. And then he really turns to the atomic war, where, again, when you perhaps look at Baudrillard for the first time and you're just looking at a bunch of his takes and seeing some of his famous quotes, you could perhaps sense that, this is a man who, he doesn't talk about perhaps the flesh or the real, and he's, so fixated on the simulation, where I think that's miscalculating that, Baudrillard knows that, most people are going to be focused more on that, or at least they have been, and so he wants to open up something else. He wants to look at things from a different way. And so simply saying that, Baudrillard doesn't care about something else because he doesn't reference it kind of misses the point of why he's actually writing about these things in such a way. So I wanted to put that in there before we consider what he has to say, that the atomic war is never going to occur, just as the Trojan War never took place, because there's a nuclear pretext, is really the sophistication of these globalized world-ending, if you'd like, weaponries that requires, of course, with the maintenance of not having the world end, if you like, that means that there has to be a global system that crushes the outside in favor of this. And so you have really the culmination of really the taking of the globe, of washing it away to return to one language and one people, which of course, in his time, and as we're getting into in the 80s, this was a very real worry among especially French left-wing intellectuals, of the sort of cartography of difference, where difference actually in a lot of ways would become operative, which I think is very key to today's world. But to go back to 1981, if you'd like, this sort of balancing, the globalism of terror is the terror of balance or equality, as he puts it. And that's really how he sees the likes of the atomic war not actually occurring, because of course there's a sort of preconceived notion of it already actually happening in that sort of way. But to demonstrate more and to look at what he has to say about a lot of cultural things using this analysis here, he really wants to demonstrate this with how he looks at the Vietnam War. And so when the U.S. pulls out of Vietnam and the war, at least in the flesh, ended, the northern Vietnamese troops represented, of course, this sort of mystery, this sort of outside of the system, where the United States represented that global one language, one people. And so by actually insinuating the conflict, or at least exacerbating this sort of difference between the global system and being outside of it, this actually gave the northern Vietnamese a sort of identity, a sort of way of mapping onto the territory their otherness. And by doing that, the Americans had actually won the war without firing a single shot. Well, sure, there is the war that's going on in the background, but Baudrillard wants to talk about the war that's going on with Simulacra and Simulation. And in that capacity, when you don't consider the warfare that's going on beyond the flesh now, the flesh suffers the same, and the deaths of the combatants are ultimately worth just as much as the wars that are taking place in the simulacrum. Again, this is to reiterate that Baudrillard doesn't want to reduce down that obviously casualties and manpower and warfare in that sense obviously matters, and there's a need for empathy and perhaps even pride to your people, but what of, again, the simulacrum? And so again, in that sense, and as he would get on later to the 90s with the Gulf War, where he famously talks about the Gulf War not actually happening, this war finished before it started because you formalized the North Vietnamese into the system. And look at all those statistics we have of the Vietnamese now actually having more of a sort of intimacy towards the global power of America than its own citizens do. If you compared the Vietnamese favorability of America and compared it to actual Americans, you would actually see that the Vietnamese are more favorable than we are of our own system. And, I think putting that in there, you could perhaps see what Baudrillard was really getting at with, having them actually enter into the system with the start of the Vietnam War. And in that sense, it was already finished before it began. Which, again, is a sort of precursor, really, to the Gulf War writings that he really gets at. And you can see that here with how he looks at the Vietnam War. And so the capacity of the Vietnamese totalizing themselves to the function of warfare is itself the end of the war by entering recognition, by rendering the sort of other or the revolutionary seductive aspects to it to real concrete tangible elements of geopolitics and warfare itself. And now, at least in this part of the text, you really have to go through a gambit of all of these different takes he has of the likes of cinema, and in particular here with the Holocaust, where he talks of the TV program, which of course is not a neutral presentation of events as they occur, the sort of states of affairs, if you like, the bodily, if you would, and so the disappearance of history and really the secularization of history, or at least how it's presented in this sort of coding of being neutral, of recording these events as they happen. That's plays into how this sort of historical event could be more real than that one, because it's presented through the proliferation of mass media in that sort of pictorial way. And so this in of itself is is falling prey really to the method, and the forgetting, as the case with the Holocaust, is ultimately too dangerous and gives us the opening of a sort of artificial memory in its effacement. And so we're constantly restaging the profound, disturbing aspects through these channels of mediums that radiates this sort of coldness of how this is how it happened, and this is what was done, and it's just constantly reiterated over and over again. And then you have the sort of soundtrack and the images, the cinema then steps in. And of course, they're not the actual crematories, but is a sort of traumatizing simulation, if you like, towards that reality. And so the images, which of course, perhaps, they did, of course, have that sort of reference, but now they elicit a sort of response through the traumatic imagery. And then if we're going to look at what he has to say of Apocalypse Now, where Baudrillard says that, America perhaps lost the Vietnam War on the ground, if you'd like, by, pulling out, but they won in the instance of the film. The film itself is the victory of the U.S. The use of the cinema and how it presented itself was a totally different war that the Vietnamese weren't prepared for. And since then, you could perhaps say that if there is certainly some contrarian historical analysis that suggests that we only pulled out really of Vietnam because if we had already won the war in the simulacrum, if you'd like, then the actual on the ground movement, and then once they were integrated and put into the actual system, mission accomplished. It didn't really matter what the actual counts of the civilian casualties or the counts of the American casualties really were in the real war, if you like. In the sort of reversing, we can actually put into the film that we had actually lost the war. And so there's a sort of mythology that's even formed since then of how we look at the Vietnamese and how it almost becomes a David and Goliath story, where to perhaps bring in what he had to say earlier about weeding out the sort of bad actors to create a space for where the real people will be. That kind of reiterates here where the film now has been adjusted to consider that away from actual states of affairs. But to perhaps be a little less abstract about this, consider when you're reading a sort of history book, and you may have a bunch of facts or figures, a numeric sequence, if you like, of this battle cost this many lives, or this incident cost the geopolitical realities of transpiring towards this next event. Whatever the case may be in your analysis in a sort of textbook, would that really compare to how, let's say, the vastness of images of something like Saving Private Ryan, when the start of the film where they're storming Normandy and the beaches, and there's just chaos and blood and death all around you? What do you think of first in that capacity? Do you think of all of these figures of World War II and the movement of the Alliance through Italy and how costly it was? Or do you think of movies? Do you think of Tom Hanks? Do you think of Forrest Gump, where Vietnam's introduced in his story, where you have these faceless enemies, you have this artillery fire going on in this jungle, and Tom Hanks, or Forrest Gump if you like, is saving all of his comrades. Is that gonna pull more at your senses than just reading a sort of abstract writing or supposed states of affairs way of how history unfolded? I think that's really what Baudrillard is trying to get at with the allure of cinema, and how pictorial images mold our history now. And really in the cinema, Baudrillard points to how people outside of our system, at least certainly with some of the films I talked about here, and he talks about, there's a sort of facelessness to it. There's a lack of identity towards the enemy. And so this denial of an opposition and really the eradication of difference is really the thesis that Baudrillard is pointing at, and shows here by not giving an actual identity to the North Vietnamese, if you like, in film renditions of it. There's, enemy fire, but the enemies themselves are never really brought in. And so this denial of an opposition is something Baudrillard points us to. You could say, of course, that Baudrillard cares about differences and trying to preserve them away from a sort of globalizing and instrumentalization, really, of people. But, what do we make of that now in a world that kind of really encourages diversity, if you'd like, or at least the state certainly does, with things like subsidies, or just really the cultural teachings and modes of messages that we get bombarded with by giant corporations, if you'd like. And so perhaps, taking up with Baudrillard here, we could perhaps turn Baudrillard on Baudrillard, as he would suggest, and suggest this sort of suspicion towards this artificial diversity within the state apparatus, where, if we want identity or to be acknowledged by the other, or to be given credence, if you'd like, from the state apparatus to express our individual identities, if you'd like, then this could only happen perhaps because there's no actual threat to that state apparatus. You could have as much diversity as you'd like now, simply because there's no actual seduction to it. There's nothing really revolutionary about it. In fact, of course, if you want to take a neo-reactionary reading here, you would say, of course, that the very diversity that we find ourselves in was actually the telos that was maybe not intended, but ultimately culminated with the theory really that created our Constitution, and could be used to capitulate as such to contemporary politics today. Baudrillard essentially is saying that the objects are no longer commodities, they're interrogates. We're summoned to answer within the question, within the same medium and information, towards the verification of codes, of fashion, of what's expected of us. And so the code for Baudrillard is really the established cultural norm or law of equal in the structural of the law of values, what he would consider a sort of coherent system, or the gaining of degrees of power, and how its maintenance is done towards the opposition against it. And then this really sets the stage, at least at this halfway point, which I'm going to end the video on here, with how you would see the future, if you'd like, or the model or arrangement is ultimately one of the hypermarket. And so he specifically points out from about 1850 to a century later in 1950, with the modernist department and really outlet mall store, where you have the proliferation of it. Everything, there's a Walmart, across the world, right? And yet they're all displayed with the same sort of functionality of, walking through it, having all the price tags facing you, having certain products that are cheaper to be displayed in certain areas to kind of lure you in to buy the more expensive one down the aisle. That's actually something that's mentioned a lot in economic courses of persuasion and those sort of tactics. These same tactics now are used across the globe as people are instrumentalized into a liquefied really of, or the liquefying really of the city-state, where it gives way to really the metropolitan area. We have moved, from the production of the sort of aggregate of a land territory, if you like, where groups of people are coming together, even though in some capacity people would find that actually troublesome, akin to Spangler there, but this is actually an even perhaps more daunting mode that Baudrillard points out here, where we've moved even beyond just what the production of that city and how it amalgamates towards the neighboring territory. There's no reference anymore. It is simply just a sort of excess that's now almost like a sort of parasite, if you like, hanging on to these milieus that no longer have a sort of reference to any people or place or thing in its relation. And it's a totally, foreign, almost alien-like concept. And I think that's really the images I want to plant here with something like that he considers with the sign of wealth or the sign of money, and not the aura or initial milieus of the territory. And you see this all the time, I think, culturally, of course. What is one of the most highest viewed and retentive category on YouTube is, of course, self-improvement and the cultivation, really, of different teloses of man, or at least what he seeks to do in this life. Is it really about actually achieving them in an external way, or at least a greater understanding? Or would we just simply want the statuses, the signs, the significance that comes with it, with the rewards, as opposed to what it actually would take to culminate those sorts of things? I think most people would much rather have the sign of the status of something like a fully lived life, if you like, of status, of health, of good family ties. What if you only had, the references, if you'd like? You didn't actually have to do anything. You're sort of supplementing that in there, which I think is, a popular, well, maybe not popular, I would say, which I think is a very interesting way to look at how American culture is at the moment, or at least our global internet culture, if you'd like. We're simply referencing these status games as opposed to how they actually came about, what they really represented towards the milieu, if you like, or that past territory in its historical context, to now just give away to, well, this is what we want, this is what we desire, and if I can have any sort of significance towards it, then that actually is what's really valuable, even more than perhaps the other alternative. And so I want to end this video now with that, and I hope you guys enjoyed it, and consider liking, comment, subscribing, making conversations happen on these videos. I enjoy reading the comments, even though I don't get to reply to all of them. And make sure to share this video around if you enjoy it, and I'll see you for the second part of Simulacra and Simulation.